Welcome to Criminal Nights, where the shadows hold secrets and the silence speaks volumes. I'm your host, and tonight we dive deep into stories that will chill your bones and haunt your dreams. If you're new here, subscribe now, because once you enter our world of true crime, there's no turning back. Hit that notification bell and let the darkness consume you. Tonight's story will take you to a place where evil wore a familiar face, where trust became a weapon, and where a small town's darkest secrets were buried beneath layers of snow and lies. December 15th, 2019, 11:47 p.m. The temperature in Hollow Creek, Montana, had dropped to -12 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that turns your breath into crystals and makes your bones ache with each step. Sarah Chen's Honda Civic sat abandoned on Route 41, its hazard lights blinking like a desperate heartbeat against the endless white. The driver's door hung open, snow accumulating on the leather seats. Her purse remained untouched on the passenger's side, credit cards and cash still inside. But Sarah was gone. Detective Marcus Webb arrived at the scene 43 minutes after the 911 call. A local trucker had spotted the vehicle during his late-night haul to Billings. Webb, a 20-year veteran of the Montana State Police, had seen his share of winter accidents. Cars sliding off icy roads, drivers wandering into the wilderness in shock, hypothermia claiming victims before help could arrive. But something about this scene felt different, wrong. Sarah's footprints led away from the car, clear and deliberate in the fresh snow. They didn't wander aimlessly, like those of a confused accident victim. They walked with purpose, following the tree line for exactly 847 feet before, ... They stopped. Not gradually, not scattered by wind or covered by fresh snowfall. They simply ended, as if Sarah Chen had vanished into thin air. Webb knelt beside the last footprint, his flashlight revealing something that would haunt him for months to come. Pressed deep into the snow, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a second set of prints, larger, heavier. Following Sarah's exact path, the official missing person report was filed at 2:34 a.m. on December 16th. Sarah's roommate, Jennifer Walsh, had called police when Sarah failed to return from her evening shift at Hollow Creek General Hospital. Sarah Chen, 28, was a surgical nurse known for her reliability. She never missed work, never broke promises, never disappeared without explanation. But as Detective Webb would soon discover, Hollow Creek held secrets that ran deeper than its frozen streams. Secrets that connected Sarah's disappearance to a web of violence that had been growing in the shadows for over 3 years. The first hint came from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, head of surgery at the hospital. During questioning, her hands trembled as she spoke about Sarah's recent concerns. She'd been acting strange for weeks, Morrison told Webb, her voice barely above a whisper. Staying late, asking questions about old patient files, looking over her shoulder like someone was watching her. What kind of questions? Webb pressed. About deaths. Specifically, about deaths that shouldn't have happened. 3 days earlier, Sarah had approached Dr. Morrison with a manila folder containing photocopies of patient records. 7 patients who had died under seemingly natural circumstances over the past 18 months. All elderly, all alone, all under the care of the same person during their final hours. The name written on each chart sent a chill through Dr. Morrison's spine. David Kellner, R.N. Kellner, had worked at Hollow Creek General for 4 years. A quiet man in his early 30s, he lived alone in a cabin 15 miles outside town. Colleagues described him as competent but cold, professional but distant. He volunteered for the night shifts that others avoided, working alone with the most vulnerable patients. When the hospital was at its quietest, Sarah's research had uncovered a pattern that the hospital administration had either missed or chosen to ignore. Each of the 7 patients had shown signs of improvement before suddenly deteriorating. Each had been found dead during Kellner's shifts, often discovered hours after their last vital signs check. and each death had been ruled natural by the county coroner, Dr. James Kellner, David's father. Webb studied the evidence Sarah had gathered, medication logs with subtle discrepancies, security footage showing Kellner entering patient rooms during financial records revealing that 5 of the 7 deceased patients had recently updated their wills, naming various charities as beneficiaries, charities that, upon investigation, appeared to exist only on paper. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Hidden in Sarah's apartment, taped to the underside of her desk drawer, Detective Webb found a USB drive. The files it contained would transform a missing person case into something far more sinister. The drive held video footage from Sarah's phone, recorded secretly during her final week at the hospital. Grainy, shaky images of David Kellner moving through darkened hallways, carrying syringes that shouldn't have existed, entering rooms of patients who would be dead by morning, and in the last video, recorded on December 14th, just hours before Sarah's disappearance, Kellner could be seen staring directly at the camera. He knew he was being watched. He knew Sarah Chen had discovered his secret. The final entry in Sarah's hidden notes was dated December 15th, 2019, 6:47 p.m. Just for words that would haunt Detective Webb's investigation. He knows I know. As Webb closed Sarah's notebook and stared out at the frozen landscape of Hollow Creek, he realized that Sarah Chen's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was the desperate act of a killer trying to cover his tracks. A killer who had been hiding in plain sight, wearing scrubs and a badge, using his position of trust to prey on the most vulnerable. But the question that would drive Webb's obsession for the next 6 months remained unanswered. Was Sarah Chen still alive somewhere in the Montana wilderness? Or had David Kellner already silenced the only witness to his crimes? The answer lay buried beneath the snow, waiting to be discovered. And as Webb would soon learn, David Kellner's secrets ran deeper and darker than anyone in Hollow Creek could have imagined. What started as a missing person case was about to become the most disturbing investigation in Montana's history, because Sarah Chen hadn't just discovered a killer, she had uncovered a family legacy of death that stretched back generations. The nightmare in Hollow Creek was just beginning. The search for Sarah Chen began at dawn on December 16, 2019. Detective Webb assembled a team of 12 officers and volunteers, their breath forming clouds in the bitter Montana air as they spread across the frozen wilderness surrounding Route 41. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees overnight, making survival nearly impossible for anyone exposed to the elements. But Webb's instincts told him they weren't looking for a victim of the cold. They were hunting for evidence of something far more sinister. David Kellner reported to work that morning as if nothing had happened. His colleagues at Hollow Creek General Hospital later described his behavior as eerily normal. He completed his shift change paperwork with his usual methodical precision, checked on his assigned patients, and even volunteered to cover an extra hour for a colleague running late. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the same dedicated nurse they had worked alongside for 4 years. But Detective Webb was watching now, and Webb saw the subtle signs that others had missed. Kellner's uniform was spotless, freshly laundered, despite working the previous night shift. His boots showed no traces of snow or mud, unusual for someone living 15 miles outside town on unpaved roads. Most telling of all, when Webb interviewed him about Sarah Chen's disappearance, Kellner displayed no surprise, no concern, no emotion at all. He simply stated that he barely knew the missing nurse and couldn't offer any helpful information. "Did you work with Sarah on December 15th? Webb asked during their first interview. "We overlapped for about an hour during shift change," replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "She seemed normal, nothing unusual to report." Webb made a note of the phrasing, "nothing unusual to report." It was the language of someone accustomed to documenting events, someone who understood the importance of official records. someone who knew exactly what could and couldn't be proven. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martha Hendricks, a 67-year-old patient in the hospital's extended care unit, had been scheduled for discharge on December 16th. When Webb interviewed her as part of his routine questioning of hospital staff and patients, she mentioned something that made his blood run cold. That nurse, the quiet one with the dead eyes, she told Webb, her voice shaking. He was in my room the night before last, around midnight. Wasn't supposed to be my nurse that night, but there he was, standing by my bed with a syringe. Webb leaned forward. What happened? I pretended to be asleep, but I was watching through my eyelashes. He stood there for the longest time, just staring down at me. Then he looked at my chart, looked back at me, and walked out. Never saw someone move so quiet in my life. Martha Hendricks had been scheduled to be under David Kellner's care that night. She had also recently updated her will, leaving her modest estate to a charity that Webb's investigation would later prove didn't exist. By all patterns established in Sarah's research, Martha should have died during Kellner's shift. But something had changed his mind. Something had made him abort whatever he had planned. Webb realized that Sarah Chen's investigation had spooked Kellner. The killer had sensed he was being watched and had become more cautious. But this caution had also made him desperate enough to eliminate the threat Sarah represented. The second interview with David Kellner took place on December 18th, this time at the police station. Webb had spent the previous day gathering background information that painted a disturbing picture of the Kellner family history. David Thomas Kellner was born on March 3, 1987, in Hollow Creek, Montana. His father, Dr. James Kellner, had served as the county coroner for over 20 years. His mother, Patricia Kellner, had died when David was 12 years old, officially from complications related to diabetes. But Webb discovered that Patricia had been admitted to Hollow Creek General Hospital multiple times in the months before her death, each time under the care of her own husband. David had grown up in a household where death was a constant presence. His father brought work home, discussing autopsy findings and death certificates at the dinner table. Young David had helped organize medical files, had learned to read coroner reports before he could properly read novels. Death to the Kellner family was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a process to be managed, documented, and sometimes facilitated. After graduating from nursing school in Billings, David returned to Hollow Creek and immediately found employment at the hospital where his father held significant influence. The hiring process had been unusually fast, with minimal background checks or reference verification. Dr. Morrison later admitted that Dr. James Kellner had personally recommended his son for the position, vouching for his character and qualifications. But the most disturbing discovery in David's background came from his high school records. In 1999, when David was 12, 3 elderly residents of Hollow Creek had died within a single week. All 3 deaths occurred while David was visiting as part of a school volunteer program. All 3 had been ruled natural by his father, the coroner, and all 3 had left small bequests to various local charities in their wills. The pattern had been there for over 20 years. Webb realized he wasn't dealing with a serial killer who had recently begun his crimes. He was facing someone who had been perfecting his methods since childhood, learning from a father who had the power to cover up any suspicious deaths. During the second interview, Webb confronted Kellner with some of this information. He watched carefully for any reaction, any crack in the man's emotionless facade. But Kellner remained perfectly calm, answering each question with the same measured, clinical tone. "My father has always been dedicated to serving this community," Kellner said when asked about the coroner's findings. "His professional reputation is beyond reproach." "And what about your relationship with Sarah Chen?" Webb pressed by the first time. Something flickered behind Kellner's eyes. It was gone in an instant, but Webb caught it. Fear, or perhaps anger. "I've already told you, Detective. I barely knew the woman. Webb pulled out a photograph taken from the hospital's security footage. It showed Kellner and Sarah in the hospital parking lot on December 12th, 3 days before her disappearance. They appeared to be having an intense conversation, with Sarah pointing at something in a manila folder, while Kellner stood uncomfortably close to her. "This doesn't look like two people who barely knew each other," Webb observed. Kellner studied the photograph for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The mask of professional courtesy had slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Sarah Chen was asking questions that weren't her business," he said quietly. "She was interfering with things she didn't understand." "What kind of things?" Kellner leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, Webb thought he might actually confess. But instead, he simply said, "I think I should contact a lawyer." The interview ended there, but Webb had heard enough. The way Kellner spoke about Sarah, the subtle admission that she had been investigating something, the cold detachment with which he discussed her disappearance, it all confirmed what Webb had begun to suspect. Sarah Chen wasn't missing. Sarah Chen was dead, and David Kellner had killed her to protect a secret that went far beyond a few suspicious deaths at the hospital. But proving it would require finding her body, and in the vast wilderness surrounding Hollow Creek, that seemed nearly impossible. The snow continued to fall, covering tracks and burying evidence with each passing hour. If Sarah Chen was out there somewhere, time was running out to find her before winter claimed any remaining traces of what had happened on that frozen night. As Webb left the police station that evening, he didn't notice the figure watching from the shadows across the street. David Kellner stood motionless beside his truck, studying the detective who had become such a persistent threat. Webb had come too close to the truth, asked too many dangerous questions, and David Kellner had learned long ago that some problems required permanent solutions. The game of cat and mouse was just beginning, but the stakes were about to become deadly for everyone involved. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on December 19th. Detective Webb was jolted awake by the shrill ring of his phone, his mind immediately snapping to attention. After 20 years in law enforcement, he had learned to recognize the tone that meant something terrible had happened. "Webb," he answered, already reaching for his clothes. "Detective, we need you at Hollow Creek General Hospital, immediately." The voice belonged to Officer Janet Rodriguez, one of the younger members of his team. "We have a situation." Webb's blood ran cold. "What kind of situation?" "A patient died during the night shift. Margaret Wilson, 74 years old, admitted yesterday for routine gallbladder surgery. She was recovering well, expected to go home tomorrow." The detective was already pulling on his boots. "What makes this our case?" "Margaret Wilson left everything to the Hollow Creek Children's Foundation in her will. Changed it last week, and Detective David Kellner was her night nurse. Webb arrived at the hospital to find it in quiet chaos. The usual calm efficiency of the night shift had been replaced by whispered conversations and worried glances. Word had spread quickly through the staff that police were investigating Margaret Wilson's death, and everyone seemed to understand what that implied. Dr. Morrison met Webb at the main entrance, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, which, Webb suspected, was probably true. "She was fine when I checked on her at 10 p.m., Morrison said as she led Webb through the corridors. "Vitals were stable, pain was manageable, spirits were good. She was even joking with her roommate about getting back to her garden." "When was she found?" 6:45 during shift change. Kellner reported that he had checked on her at 4 a.m., and she was sleeping peacefully. By morning rounds, she was gone. Webb studied the scene in Margaret Wilson's room. The elderly woman lay peacefully in her hospital bed, her hands folded neatly over her chest. To a casual observer, she looked like she had simply passed away in her sleep. But Webb noticed the small details that seemed wrong. The fourth line had been disconnected and reconnected, evidenced by small drops of medication on the floor beside the bed. Margaret's water glass had been refilled recently. despite the fact that she had been unconscious when found. Most tellingly, her chart showed vital signs checks every 2 hours throughout the night, but the handwriting on the last 3 entries looked different from the earlier ones. "I want to talk to her roommate," Webb said. Helen Garcia, 68, had been admitted for hip replacement surgery and was scheduled to be discharged later that day. She sat in her wheelchair, still groggy from pain medication but alert enough to provide crucial information. "That nurse came in around 2 a.m., Helen told Webb, her voice barely above a whisper. "Woke me up when he turned on his little flashlight. Margaret was sleeping, breathing normal, looked peaceful. What did he do? Fussed with her for a while. Seemed like he was adding something to it, but I couldn't see clearly. Then he stood there for the longest time, just watching her. Made me uncomfortable, so I pretended to go back to sleep." Helen paused, struggling to remember through the fog of medication and exhaustion. "But I kept watching through my eyelashes. After about 10 minutes, Margaret started breathing different, shallow, like. Then she got real still. That nurse," he checked her pulse, wrote something on her chart, and left. Never called for help, never turned on the lights, never seemed surprised that she had stopped breathing." Webb felt the familiar chill that came with hearing a first-hand account of murder. "Did you say anything? Call for help?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared. Something about the way he moved, so calm and quiet, like he was used to watching people die. I thought if I said something, if I let him know I was awake, I was afraid I might be next." The detective spent the next hour examining Margaret Wilson's medical records and medication logs. The pattern was identical to the cases Sarah Chen had documented. Margaret had been recovering well from routine surgery when her condition suddenly deteriorated. The medications listed on her chart didn't match the standard post-operative protocols. And most damning of all, Margaret had indeed updated her will the previous week, leaving her modest savings and her small home to the Hollow Creek Children's Foundation. Webb's investigation into the charity revealed what he had expected to find. The Hollow Creek Children's Foundation existed only on paper, incorporated 6 years earlier, with David Kellner listed as its founding director. The foundation's mailing address was a post office box in Billings, and its bank account showed regular deposits from estate settlements, but no record of any charitable activities or donations. The scope of the crime was staggering. Webb realized that David Kellner hadn't just been killing patients randomly. He had been systematically targeting vulnerable elderly people, manipulating them into changing their wills, and then murdering them to collect their estates through his fraudulent charity. The operation was sophisticated, patient, and had been running for years under the protection of his father's position as county coroner. But the most chilling aspect was the psychological profile that emerged from Webb's investigation. This wasn't a killer driven by rage or passion. David Kellner was a predator who had turned murder into a business, who killed with the same clinical detachment with which he administered medication. He had weaponized the trust patients placed in healthcare workers, turning their vulnerability into his opportunity. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Webb knew he needed more to build a solid case, but he also knew that every day Kellner remained free, more lives were at risk. The killer had already demonstrated his willingness to eliminate threats, and Sarah Chen's continued absence proved he was capable of making people disappear completely. Webb decided to take a calculated risk. He would increase pressure on David Kellner, making it clear that the investigation was closing in. The hope was that pressure would force Kellner to make a mistake, to reveal information about Sarah's fate, or to lead police to evidence they hadn't yet discovered. But Webb underestimated the depth of David Kellner's desperation and the extent of the family's criminal network. On the evening of December 19th, Webb received an unexpected visitor at his home. Dr. James Kellner, the county coroner, stood on Webb's front porch, wearing an expensive overcoat and an expression of barely contained fury. "Detective Webb, I think we need to talk," the older Kellner said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Webb invited him inside, curious about what the coroner would say in defense of his son. What he heard instead was a confession that would shake his understanding of the case to its core. "My son has always been troubled," Dr. Kellner began, settling into Webb's living room as if he belonged there. "Even as a child, he showed concerning behaviors. But I thought I could control him, guide him, help him channel his impulses in less destructive ways." "Less destructive than murder?" Webb asked. Dr. Kellner's laugh was bitter and cold. "You think?" "This started with David. Detective, my family has been managing death in this county for 3 generations. My father before me, and his father before him. We've always understood that some deaths serve a greater purpose." Webb stared at the man who had been ruling on causes of death in Hollow Creek for over 2 decades. "You've been covering for him. All those deaths you ruled natural, ... I've been protecting this community from chaos," Dr. Kellner corrected. "Do you have any idea what would happen if people lost faith in their healthcare system? If they stopped trusting their doctors and nurses?" David was providing a service, helping suffering people find peace while ensuring their assets went to worthy causes, rather than being squandered by distant relatives who never visited. The twisted logic was breathtaking in its audacity. Dr. Kellner had convinced himself that his son's murder spree was some form of mercy killing combined with estate planning. But Webb could see the fear behind the rationalizations. The coroner was here because he knew the investigation was getting too close to the truth. "Where is Sarah Chen?" Webb asked directly. Dr. Kellner's composure finally cracked. That woman should have minded her own business. She was going to destroy everything we had built, expose things that were better left buried. "So you helped your son kill her?" "I helped clean up a mess," Dr. Kellner admitted, his voice now barely above a whisper. "But detective, you need to understand something. This investigation ends here. Tonight, you're going to close the Margaret Wilson case as a natural death. You're going to stop looking for Sarah Chen, and you're going to forget everything you think you've learned about my son." Webb stood up, slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. "And why would I do that?" Dr. Kellner smiled, and the expression was far more terrifying than any threat could have been. "Because, detective, you have a daughter. Emily, isn't it? 16 years old, drives a blue Honda, works part-time at the coffee shop on Main Street. It would be such a tragedy if something happened to such a bright young girl." The threat hung in the air between them like poison. Webb realized that he wasn't just investigating a serial killer. He was facing an entire family criminal enterprise that had operated in Hollow Creek for decades, protected by positions of authority and willing to kill anyone who threatened their operation. But what Dr. Kellner didn't know was that Webb had been recording their conversation. Every word, every admission, every threat was being captured by the small device, hidden in his shirt pocket. The war for Hollow Creek's soul was about to begin, and Detective Webb had just learned exactly how high the stakes really were. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, make sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. The darkness in Hollow Creek runs deeper than anyone could have imagined. The recording device in Detective Webb's pocket captured every word of Dr. James Kellner's confession and threats. But as the coroner left his house that night, Webb faced a terrible dilemma. He now had evidence of a multi-generational conspiracy of murder, but using it would put his 16-year-old daughter Emily directly in the crosshairs of killers who had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate. Threats. Webb spent the sleepless hours before dawn making the hardest decision of his career. By 6 a.m., he had called his ex-wife in Seattle and arranged for Emily to visit her grandmother in Vancouver under the pretense of an early Christmas vacation. By 7 a.m., he had contacted FBI agent Maria Santos in Billings, requesting federal assistance. with what he now understood was a case far beyond the scope of local law enforcement. But David Kellner was also making preparations. The younger Kellner arrived at Hollow Creek General Hospital that morning, carrying a small black medical bag that wasn't part of his usual equipment. Inside were vials of potassium chloride, insulin, and all medications that could cause cardiac arrest when administered in lethal doses. He had also brought something else, something that would ensure Detective Webb understood the consequences of pursuing his investigation. At 10:15 a.m., Webb received a call that made his blood freeze. Emily's car had been found abandoned in the parking lot of Hollow Creek High School. Her backpack was still inside, along with her phone and wallet, but Emily was gone. Webb raced to the school, his mind reeling with the implications. Dr. Kellner's threat had been delivered less than 12 hours ago, and now his daughter was missing. The speed with which the Kellners had acted proved they had been prepared for this possibility, had planned for the eventuality that their operation might be discovered. The high school's security cameras told a chilling story. At 9:47 a.m., Emily had arrived at school, as usual, parking in her assigned spot and walking toward the main entrance, but she never made it inside. The footage showed a man approaching her from behind as she walked across the parking lot. The figure was too distant to identify clearly, but Webb recognized the methodical, unhurried gait. David Kellner had taken his daughter, Principal Janet Morrison. Dr. Morrison's sister met Webb in the school's main office. Her face was pale with worry, and she immediately provided access to all security footage and student records. Emily never made it to first period, she told Webb, her voice shaking. Her English teacher marked her absent, but we didn't think anything of it until you called. Webb studied the security footage frame by frame, looking for any clue that might indicate where Kellner had taken Emily. The timestamp showed the abduction had occurred just 28 minutes after Webb had contacted the FBI. Someone had been watching him, monitoring his communications, waiting for him to escalate the investigation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Kellners had access to police communications. Dr. James Kellner's position as county coroner gave him legitimate reasons to monitor law enforcement channels, and he had probably been tracking Webb's investigation from the beginning. Every move Webb had made, every witness he had interviewed, every piece of evidence he had gathered, the Kellners had known about it. Webb's radio crackled with an incoming message. Detective Webb, please respond to Hollow Creek General Hospital immediately. We have a situation in the emergency department. Webb's heart sank as he drove toward the hospital. Another situation at the hospital could only mean one thing. David Kellner had struck again. But as Webb arrived at the emergency department, he discovered that this time was different. This time, there was a survivor. Helen Garcia, Margaret Wilson's former roommate, sat in a hospital bed hooked to an IV drip and oxygen monitor. She was conscious but weak, her skin pale and clammy. Dr. Morrison stood beside her bed, checking her vital signs with obvious concern. What happened? Webb asked. Someone tried to poison her, Dr. Morrison replied grimly. Helen was found in her hospital room this morning, unconscious and barely breathing. Blood tests show massive amounts of insulin in her system, enough to have killed her if we hadn't found her when we did. Webb looked at Helen, who was struggling to speak through the oxygen mask. He leaned closer to hear her whispered words. He came back, she managed to say. The nurse from the other night said he was giving me something for pain, but I recognized him. I tried to call for help, but everything went black. Dr. Morrison pulled Webb aside. Helen is diabetic, but she doesn't take insulin. Her blood sugar was dangerously low when we found her. Someone injected her with a massive overdose, probably hoping it would look like a diabetic emergency. If the day shift nurse hadn't found her when she did. Webb realized that David Kellner had returned to eliminate the only witness to Margaret Wilson's murder. Helen Garcia had seen too much, knew too much, and Kellner couldn't risk her testimony in court. But this time, his attempt had failed. This time, There was a surviving victim who could testify to his crimes. But Webb's moment of satisfaction was short-lived. His radio crackled again, this time with a message that made his knees buckle. "Detective Webb, we've received a phone call. You need to hear. The caller claims to have information about your daughter." Webb raced back to the police station, where Officer Rodriguez was waiting with a digital recording of the phone call that had come in 30 minutes earlier. Webb recognized the voice immediately, David Kellner, speaking with the same calm, clinical tone he had used during their interviews. "Detective Webb, I assume you've discovered your daughter's absence by now. Emily is safe, for the moment, but her continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. You will close the Margaret Wilson case as a natural death. You will discontinue any investigation into deaths at Hollow Creek General Hospital. You will inform the FBI that their assistance is no longer needed. You have 24 hours to comply with these demands. If you fail to do so, Emily will join Sarah, Chen, and neither of them will ever be found." The message continued with specific instructions. Webb was to hold a press conference announcing that Margaret Wilson had died of post-surgical complications and that no criminal investigation was warranted. He was to publicly state that Sarah Chen's disappearance was being treated as a missing person case with no evidence of foul play. Most importantly, he was to ensure that both David and Dr. James Kellner were publicly cleared of any suspicion. "Detective," the recording concluded, "I want you to understand something. My family has been managing death in this county for 3 generations. We know how to make people disappear without a trace. Emily and Sarah are currently guests at a location where their remains will never be discovered, regardless of how many search teams you send into the wilderness. You have 1 day to save your daughter's life. Choose wisely." Webb played the recording 3 times, analyzing every word, every inflection, looking for any clue that might indicate where Emily and Sarah were being held. The background noise was minimal, but he could detect a faint echo that suggested an enclosed space, possibly underground. There was also a subtle mechanical hum, like ventilation equipment or generators. The pieces of a desperate plan began forming in Webb's mind. The Kellners believed they held all the cards, that they could force his cooperation through threats to Emily's life. But they had underestimated both Webb's determination and the resources now at his disposal. FBI agent Maria Santos arrived in Hollow Creek at 4 p.m., accompanied by a team of federal investigators and forensic specialists. Webb met them at the police station and immediately shared everything he had discovered, including the recordings of both Dr. Kellner's confession and David Kellner's ransom demands. "This is a RICO case now," Santos told Webb after reviewing the evidence: organized criminal enterprise, conspiracy, murder, kidnapping, extortion. "We're going to shut down this entire operation." But Webb's primary concern wasn't building a federal case. His daughter was somewhere in the Montana wilderness with a serial killer, and time was running out. The Kellners had given him 2 hours, but Webb knew from studying David's psychological profile that the man was too dangerous to keep hostages alive for long. Emily and Sarah, if she was still alive, probably had hours, not days. As darkness fell over Hollow Creek on December 19th, Webb faced the most crucial night of his career. Somewhere in the frozen wilderness, his daughter was fighting for her life, and Detective Marcus Webb was about to learn just how far a father would go to save his child from the monsters hiding in plain sight. The hunt for Emily Webb and Sarah Chen was about to begin, but the Kellners had been preparing for this confrontation for decades. They knew the terrain. They had resources Webb was only beginning to understand, and they had nothing left to lose. The final battle for Hollow Creek's soul would be fought in the darkness, where the line between predator and prey was about to become terrifyingly unclear. The basement of the old Kellner family property stretched far deeper underground than anyone in Hollow Creek had ever imagined. Built in 1952 by David's grandfather, Dr. Heinrich Kellner, the underground facility had originally served as a Cold War fallout shelter. Over the decades, successive generations of Kellners had expanded and modified the space, turning it into something far more sinister than its creator had ever intended. Sarah Chan had been imprisoned in this underground tomb for 4 days now. The concrete walls were soundproof, lined with medical equipment that belonged in a hospital rather than a private residence. Examination tables, monitoring devices, cabinets filled with pharmaceutical supplies, and most terrifyingly, an autopsy table complete with drainage systems and surgical lighting. Sarah's nursing training told her exactly what this place was designed for. The Kellners hadn't just been killing people at the hospital. They had been bringing victims here, experimenting on them, studying the effects of different drugs and methods of murder. This wasn't just a family of serial killers. This was a laboratory where death had been refined into a science. Emily Webb arrived at the underground facility on December 19th, unconscious from a sedative David Kellner had administered during her abduction. She awakened to find herself strapped to a medical examination table, 4 lines already inserted into her arms. Sarah sat chained to a chair nearby, her face bearing the bruises and cuts of someone who had fought desperately for survival. "Don't struggle," Sarah whispered when Emily began to panic. "The restraints are designed for violent patients. Fighting them will only hurt you more." Emily tried to speak, but discovered a breathing tube had been inserted down her throat. The tube was connected to a ventilator, but Sarah could see that the machine had been modified. Instead of just providing oxygen, it could also deliver various gases and vapors. The Kellners were preparing to use Emily as a test subject. "Your father is a very stubborn man," David Kellner said as he descended the stairs into the basement laboratory. He wore surgical scrubs and carried a clipboard, looking every inch the professional medical practitioner. "I gave him very simple instructions, but he chose to involve the FBI instead." David checked Emily's 4 lines with the same clinical efficiency he had shown at the hospital. "Dr. Kellner believes your father will be more cooperative once he understands the consequences of his choices. We're going to send him a video message that will demonstrate exactly what happens to people who threaten our family." Sarah had been watching David's routine for 4 days, studying his methods and looking for any weakness she could exploit. She had discovered that David's calm, professional demeanor was actually a carefully constructed mask hiding a deeply disturbed individual who took sadistic pleasure in controlling his victims' final moments. "He talks to them while they die," Sarah had observed during her captivity. "Explains what each drug is doing to their body, describes how it feels, asks them questions about their symptoms. He's not just killing them, he's conducting research." The full scope of the Kellner family's crimes was documented in filing cabinets that lined the basement walls. Medical records dating back 30 years, detailed notes on drug interactions and lethal dosages, even video recordings of murders that Dr. James Kellner had classified as natural deaths. The 3 generations of Kellner coroners had used their position to perfect the art of undetectable murder, building a database of information that would have been invaluable to anyone seeking to kill without getting caught. But David's obsession with documentation would prove to be his downfall. Meanwhile, Detective Webb and FBI agent Santos were analyzing every piece of information they could find about Kellner family properties. The official records showed only the family home on Elm Street and Dr. James Kellner's medical practice. But Webb had discovered references to additional property in old county tax records, including a plot of land purchased by Heinrich Kellner in 1952 and never developed. "It's 40 acres in the mountains, 15 miles northeast of town," Webb told Santos as they studied topographical maps in the police station. "No structures listed, no utilities connected, but the tax records show it's been in the family for 70 years. Santos deployed a team of federal agents to conduct aerial surveillance of the property using thermal imaging equipment. What they discovered confirmed Webb's suspicions. The thermal cameras detected significant heat signatures coming from underground. indicating a large subterranean structure with active heating and electrical systems. "There's definitely something down there," Santos reported. "The heat signature suggests a facility much larger than a typical basement. We're looking at several thousand square feet of underground space." But as the FBI team prepared for a tactical assault on the Kellner property, David was implementing his own plan. The basement laboratory had been designed with multiple escape routes, including a tunnel system that connected to natural caves in the mountainside. If the authorities discovered their location, David and his father could disappear into the wilderness, leaving behind only the bodies of their victims. Dr. James Kellner arrived at the underground facility at midnight on December 19th, carrying a large medical bag and wearing the same surgical scrubs as his son. The elderly coroner looked exhausted and frightened, but his voice remained steady as he addressed his captives. "I want you both to understand that this isn't personal," he told Sarah and Emily. "You've become complications in a system that has worked perfectly for decades. Detective Webb forced our hand by refusing to accept the natural order of things." Dr. Kellner began preparing syringes filled with various medications, each carefully labeled with dosages and expected effects. "We're going to document your deaths very carefully," he explained with the detached tone of a university lecturer. "The information we gather will help us refine our methods for future applications." Sarah realized that the Kellners intended to kill both Emily and herself while recording the entire process for their research files. But she also noticed something that gave her hope. Dr. James Kellner's hands were shaking as he prepared the lethal injections. The elderly coroner was clearly struggling with the escalation from covering up deaths to actively participating in murder. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said, addressing the older man directly. "David is sick, but you're not. You can still stop this." Dr. Kellner paused in his preparations. "You don't understand the legacy we're protecting. 3 generations of medical service to this community. We've helped people die with dignity. We've prevented unnecessary suffering. We've ensured that resources go to worthy causes instead of being wasted." "You've been murdering innocent people for decades," Sarah replied firmly. "There's no dignity in what you've done. There's no medical justification for killing patients who trusted you." For a moment, something flickered in Dr. Kellner's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the ghost of the ethical physician he might once have been. But David noticed his father's hesitation and moved quickly to reinforce his resolve. "She's trying to manipulate you," David told his father coldly. "Just like that detective is trying to destroy everything our family has built. They don't understand the greater good we serve." Dr. Kellner's moment of doubt passed, and he returned to preparing the lethal injections. But Sarah had seen something in his expression that suggested the family alliance might not be as solid as it appeared. The elderly coroner was being manipulated by his son, just as much as the victims were, trapped in a web of criminality that had grown far beyond anything he had originally intended. As the 2 killers prepared to murder their captives, Detective Webb and the FBI tactical team were moving through the Montana wilderness toward the Kellner property. Time was running out, but Webb refused to consider the possibility that he might be too late to save his daughter. The final confrontation between law enforcement and the Kellner family was about to begin in the underground laboratory where 3 generations of murder had been planned, documented, and celebrated. But neither side fully understood how desperate and dangerous their opponents had become in the depths of the Montana mountains. Surrounded by the evidence of decades of murder, Sarah Chen and Emily Webb were about to discover whether good could truly triumph over the kind of evil that wore a medical coat and called itself mercy. The FBI tactical team reached the Kellner property at 12:47 a.m. on December 20th, moving through the snow-covered forest with military precision. Agent Santos had coordinated with Detective Webb to approach the underground facility from 3 different angles, using thermal imaging to track movement inside the structure. But as they positioned themselves around the property, Webb's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. The voice was distorted, clearly being broadcast through some kind of electronic filter, but the words were unmistakably from David Kellner. "Detective Webb, I know you're out there. I can see your heat signatures on our security monitors. You have 2 minutes to call off your team and approach the entrance alone, or I start the procedure on your daughter." Webb could hear Emily's muffled screams in the background of the transmission, and the sound nearly broke his resolve. But Agent Santos grabbed his arm before he could respond. "It's a trap," she said firmly. "If you go in there alone, you'll just become another victim. We stick to the plan." The plan was to use explosives to breach the underground facility, simultaneously from multiple entry points, overwhelming the Kellners before they could harm their hostages. But as the FBI team prepared their charges, David Kellner was implementing a contingency that would turn their rescue operation into a nightmare. Deep in the underground laboratory, David had connected Emily's ventilator to a tank of carbon monoxide instead of oxygen. The deadly gas would kill her slowly, giving him leverage over the approaching law enforcement while ensuring that she couldn't survive to testify about what she had witnessed. Dr. James Kellner watched in horror as his son calmly adjusted the gas mixture, treating his daughter's murder like any other medical procedure. "David, this has gone too far," the elderly coroner said, his voice breaking. "She's just a child. This isn't what we agreed to." David turned to face his father with an expression of cold contempt. "What we agreed to? You've been covering up my work for years, taking your share of the profits, living comfortably off the money stolen from dead patients. Don't pretend you have any moral authority now. Those people were dying anyway," Dr. Kellner protested weakly. "We were just helping them along, ensuring their assets went to good causes, instead of being wasted. And now, we're helping Detective Webb's daughter along," David replied. "The principle is exactly the same. She's a threat to our operation, so she needs to be eliminated, just like Sarah Chen, just like anyone else who gets too close to the truth." Sarah had been listening to this exchange while secretly working to free herself from her restraints. During her 4 days in captivity, she had observed that David performed the same routine every few hours, checking equipment and reviewing his medical files. During these periods, his attention would be focused away from his prisoners for several minutes at a time. Sarah had used these opportunities to gradually loosen the straps, holding her to the chair, using her nursing training to understand how the medical restraints worked. The buckles were designed to be quickly released by medical personnel, but they required specific knowledge of their mechanism, knowledge that Sarah possessed and had been carefully applying whenever David's back was turned. As David argued with his father about the ethics of murdering Emily, Sarah saw her chance. With one quick motion, she freed herself from the restraints and lunged toward the ventilator, controlling Emily's breathing. But David had been more aware of her efforts than she realized. "I was wondering when you would try that," he said calmly, catching Sarah's arm and throwing her against the concrete wall with surprising strength. "I've been watching you work on those straps for 2 days. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Sarah hit the wall hard, feeling ribs crack from the impact. But her desperate attempt had accomplished something crucial. In lunging toward Emily's ventilator, she had knocked over a cart of medical supplies, sending vials of medication crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the underground facility loud enough to be heard by the FBI team positioning themselves above. Agent Santos heard the crash through the surveillance equipment they had inserted into the ventilation system. "That's our signal," she radioed to her team. "Go, go, go." The explosions came simultaneously from 3 different points around the property. The FBI had placed shaped charges on concealed entrance points, blasting their way into the underground facility with overwhelming force. Emergency lighting activated throughout the laboratory, bathing everything in harsh red illumination that made the scene look like a vision from hell. David Kellner's reaction to the assault was swift and vicious. Instead of surrendering or attempting to escape. He grabbed a scalpel from the surgical tray and held it to Emily's throat while she lay helpless on the examination table. "Stay back," he screamed at the FBI agents pouring into the laboratory. "I'll kill her. I'll cut her throat right now." Dr. James Kellner stood frozen in the center of the chaos, his hands still holding the syringes he had prepared for the murders. The elderly coroner looked around at the laboratory that had been his family's secret for decades, now exposed under the harsh emergency lighting and filled with federal agents pointing weapons at his son. "David, please," he said quietly, "let the girl go. This is over." But David Kellner was beyond reason now. The careful, clinical facade he had maintained for years had finally cracked, revealing the savage killer underneath. His eyes were wild, his breathing rapid and shallow. He pressed the scalpel harder against Emily's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. "This is not over," he shrieked. "Do you have any idea what we've accomplished down here? The research we've conducted, the knowledge we've gained about human death and suffering. You can't just walk in here and destroy decades of work." Agent Santos kept her weapon trained on David, while slowly moving closer to the examination table, where Emily lay unconscious. "David, you're surrounded. There's nowhere to run. Let Emily go, and we can talk about this." "Talk?" David laughed, and the sound was completely devoid of sanity. "You want to talk about my work? Fine. Let me show you what 3 generations of medical expertise can accomplish." David reached toward a control panel on the wall, his intention clearly being to activate some kind of automated system that would kill both Emily and Sarah simultaneously. But, as his hand moved away from Emily's throat, Sarah Chen made her final, desperate play. Despite her broken ribs and the pain radiating through her body from David's assault, Sarah lunged forward again. This time, instead of going for the ventilator, she targeted David himself, wrapping her arms around his legs and bringing him crashing to the floor. The scalpel flew from his hand, clattering across the concrete as David and Sarah struggled for control. FBI agents immediately swarmed the examination table, cutting Emily's restraints and checking her vital signs while Agent Santos moved to secure David Kellner. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Dr. James Kellner, seeing his life's work exposed, and his son about to be arrested, made a choice that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. "I won't let you destroy everything," the elderly coroner said quietly, and before anyone could react, he plunged one of the prepared syringes into his own neck. The massive dose of potassium chloride stopped Dr. James Kellner's heart within minutes. He collapsed beside the autopsy table where he had planned to murder Detective Webb's daughter, dying with the same clinical efficiency he had brought to decades of covering up his son's crimes. David Kellner was restrained and arrested, but his screams echoed through the underground laboratory as he watched his father die. "You don't understand what you've done," he shouted at the FBI agents. "He was protecting this community. We were helping people. We were serving a greater good." As paramedics worked to stabilize Emily Webb and treat Sarah Chen's injuries, Detective Webb stood in the basement laboratory that had served as the Kellner family's house of horrors. The filing cabinets contained evidence of over 40 murders, spanning 3 decades. The medical equipment showed signs of use in hundreds of illegal experiments, and the video recordings would provide proof of crimes so disturbing that some of them would never be released to the public. Emily Webb survived her ordeal, though she would spend weeks in intensive care recovering from the drugs David had administered. Sarah Chen's injuries were severe, but not life-threatening, and her courage in fighting back had saved both their lives. But the psychological scars from their time in the Kellner laboratory would take much longer to heal. As dawn broke over Hollow Creek on December 20th, 2019, the nightmare that had plagued the small Montana town for generations was finally coming to an end. David Kellner was in federal custody, charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The underground laboratory was being dismantled by forensic specialists who would spend months cataloging the evidence of the family's crimes. But Detective Webb knew that the story of Hollow Creek was far from over. Somewhere in the mountains, buried beneath decades of snow and lies, were the bodies of victims whose names might never be known. And in the hearts and minds of Hollow Creek's residents, the knowledge that their trusted medical professionals had been predators would leave scars that might never heal. As dawn broke over Hollow Creek on December 20th, 2019, the nightmare that had plagued the small Montana town for generations was finally coming to an end. David Kellner was in federal custody, charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The underground laboratory was being dismantled by forensic specialists who would spend months cataloging the evidence of the family's crimes. But Detective Webb knew that the story of Hollow Creek was far from over. Somewhere in the mountains, buried beneath decades of snow and lies, were the bodies of victims whose names might never be known. And in the hearts and minds of Hollow Creek's residents, the knowledge that their trusted medical professionals had been predators would leave scars that might never heal. Epilogue. The Reckoning ***. 6 months after the arrest of David Kellner, the full scope of the family's crimes finally came to light. FBI forensic accountants discovered that the fake Hollow Creek Children's Foundation had collected over $2.8 million in fraudulent inheritances spanning 15 years. The money had been used to fund the underground laboratory, purchase sophisticated medical equipment, and maintain the family's comfortable lifestyle, while they systematically murdered the people who trusted them most. The search for victims' remains continued throughout the spring and summer of 2020. Ground-penetrating radar revealed burial sites scattered across the 40-acre Kellner property, some dating back to the 1970s, when David's grandfather Heinrich had first established the family's deadly tradition. Recovery teams found the remains of 37 individuals, ranging in age from 14 to 89 years old. Sarah Chen received the FBI's Medal of Valor for her courage in gathering the initial evidence that exposed the Kellner conspiracy, and for her actions in saving Emily Webb's life during their captivity. She left Hollow Creek after her recovery and now works as a patient advocate for elderly care facilities, using her experience to help prevent similar predatory schemes. Emily Webb struggled with PTSD for over a year following her ordeal, but eventually found healing through therapy and the support of her family. She now studies criminal justice at Montana State University. Inspired by her father's work to pursue a career in law enforcement, Detective Marcus Webb was promoted to Chief of Police in Hollow Creek, where he implemented new oversight protocols for the county coroner's office and established partnerships with state and federal agencies to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. The case became a textbook study in how positions of authority and trust can be exploited by predators, and Webb frequently speaks at law enforcement conferences about recognizing the warning signs of medical serial killers. David Thomas Kellner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 43 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for his crimes and continued to insist that he had been providing a medical service to the community. He remains in solitary confinement at the Montana State Prison, where he spends his days writing detailed medical journals that prison officials refuse to publish. The underground laboratory was completely dismantled and sealed, but the concrete structure remains as a tomb beneath the Montana mountains. The Kellner property was seized by the federal government and converted into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of medical abuse. A small plaque near the entrance reads, "In memory of those who placed their trust in healers who chose to harm." Hollow Creek General Hospital underwent massive reforms following the exposure of the Kellner conspiracy. New oversight procedures, background checks, and monitoring systems were implemented to ensure that no single individual could operate without scrutiny. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison remained as head of surgery and worked tirelessly to rebuild the community's faith in their medical system. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Kellner case was the change it brought to how law enforcement agencies investigate suspicious deaths. The case study became mandatory training material for coroners and medical examiners nationwide, teaching them to recognize the patterns that the Kellner family had used to hide their crimes for so long. The families of the victims found some measure of peace in knowing the truth about their loved ones' deaths. Though the financial compensation from the seized Kellner assets could never truly make up for their losses, many of them formed support groups that continued to meet monthly, helping each other process the betrayal and grief that came with learning their family members had been murdered by the very people sworn to protect them. As for Hollow Creek itself, the small Montana town slowly began to heal. The population, which had dropped significantly in the months following the revelations, began to stabilize as new residents moved in and longtime locals chose to stay and rebuild their communities' reputation. The story of the Kellner family serves as a permanent reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces, wearing white coats and carrying stethoscopes, speaking in gentle tones while planning the most heinous acts imaginable. The case files remain open as investigators continue to examine cold cases from across Montana and neighboring states. Looking for connections to the Kellner network, they have found evidence suggesting that the family may have had contact with other medical professionals who shared their twisted philosophy, and the investigation has expanded to include potential accomplices who may still be operating in hospitals and care facilities across the region today. If you drive through Hollow Creek, you'll find a community that has learned to trust cautiously and love carefully. The residents understand now that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they work the night shift at the local hospital, checking on patients with gentle hands and murderous hearts. The snow still falls in Hollow Creek every winter, covering the ground in pristine white that sparkles under the streetlights. But the residents know now that beneath that beautiful surface, darkness can hide for decades, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And they know that sometimes it takes just one person, one brave nurse willing to ask dangerous questions to bring that darkness into the light and finally make it answer for its crimes. The victims of the Kellner family can rest now. Their stories finally told, their deaths finally acknowledged, their killers finally brought to justice. But their legacy lives on in the changes made to prevent such horrors from happening again, in the training programs that teach medical professionals to recognize and report suspicious patterns, and in the knowledge that even the most carefully hidden evil can be exposed when good people refuse to look away. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey into the shadows of Hollow Creek, Montana. A story that reminds us that the most dangerous predators often hide behind the masks of respectability, using our trust as their weapon and our vulnerability as their opportunity. The case of the Kellner family changed how we investigate medical deaths, how we monitor healthcare facilities, and how we protect those who place their lives in the hands of medical professionals. It stands as a testament to the courage of individuals like Sarah Chen, who risked everything to expose the truth, and Detective Marcus Webb, who refused to let the threats against his family stop him from seeking justice for the victims. As you lay your head down tonight, remember that the darkness we've explored together exists only in the past now. The monsters of Hollow Creek have been caught, their victims have been remembered, and their evil has been brought into the light, where it can do no more harm. Thank you for joining me on this haunting journey through one of Montana's darkest chapters. If tonight's story has affected you, please remember that help is always available if you need someone to talk to. The shadows may hold secrets, but you never have to face them alone. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and remember, sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to that small voice inside us that says something isn't quite right. Trust your instincts. Look out for one another, and never be afraid to ask the difficult questions when someone's life might depend on it. This has been Criminal Nights, where the truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how deep the darkness tries to bury it. Good night and good dreams.